Hi, and welcome to Danny After Dark. If you're new here, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss a notification or a new episode. Tonight, we have a very special episode. We have a interview with a true crime historian, Harold Schechter. He is professor emeritus at Queens College, where he taught classes in American literature and myth criticism for 42 years. He is a two-time Edgar nominee who has written exclusively about some of our country's most infamous serial killers and mass murderers. Using primary sources such as newspaper clippings and court records, he supplies thorough documentation of every case he profiles, while still managing to create compelling narratives and fully fleshed out characters. Harold has written over 30 true crime books, including some numerous bestsellers. Two books in particular my audience knows him for is The Serial Killer Files and the A to Z Encyclopedia of Serial Killers. In one of my true crime book recommendations I did recently, I suggested Harold Schechter's recently 2023 published book, and I have it right here, Murderabilia, A History of Crime in 100 Objects. It is with great honor that I welcome to Danny After Dark, true crime historian and writer, Harold Schechter. Hi, Harold.
Hi, very delighted to be here. Thank you for the lovely introduction.
Well, thank you for being on this show. I have to say, I have been a fan of your work for decades.
Nice.
I own proudly every single one of your books.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much for your support.
Oh, it's such an honor to have you here and to be able to speak with you. My goodness. But I do have some questions for you that I'm hoping that you can give some great information to anybody who's watching my channel who isn't familiar with your work.
Mm-hmm.
For people that are, maybe give a little bit of insight. So first, you describe yourself as a true crime historian. For someone who, again, isn't familiar with your work, how would you differentiate that between other true crime writers?
Well, in my full-length books, I really exclusively deal with crimes that took place in the past, ranging from the post-Civil War period to the 1950s. So, many true crime books deal with contemporary crimes and so on. I first got into it writing a book about Ed Gein, the infamous Wisconsin necrophile who inspired the movies Psycho, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and served as the model for the Buffalo Bill character in Silence of the Lambs.
Yeah.
Just, in terms of your introduction, I was an academic. My day job was a literature professor. And of course, to become a literature professor, you need a PhD. And one of the things I discovered while working on my PhD was that I love to do research. So, deep research into any subject I cover. And writing about these historical cases satisfies that need for me. So for a variety of reasons, that ended up being my field, writing historical nonfiction narratives about infamous American cases from the past.
Yeah, I was going to say that's if somebody's looking to get, an understanding of like Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer, they're not necessarily going to find that with your works. You tend to cover, at least in my perspective, writings that, like you said, are more historically based and maybe some that people haven't heard of. I know I found that.
I have a whole book called Psycho USA, Famous American Serial Killers You Never Heard of. I do cover, obviously, Bundy and Gacy and, other modern day serial murderers in the two books you mentioned, the A to Z Encyclopedia of Serial Killers and the Serial Killer Files. And I also cover them in my new book, Murderabilia.
Yes.
But, Yep, there it is. Very handsome cover. But, in terms of my, again, full length books, they tend to deal with, well, they all deal with either notorious serial killers or mass murderers of the past. I think probably the Gein book, which was set in the 1950s, is the most chronologically recent of the books that I've done.
Yeah. What I found so unique about your books compared to other true crime authors is that your books not only cover in depth the case, but as a reader, I find you can tell how much research that you put into the actual time period that the crimes occurred, which is really important for context. You also cover what I don't see in a lot of other books is the communities that the crime occurred in before they occurred, during this, when everything comes to light. And then not only that, but after, what the communities are going through after. Your books also aren't overly gory that I find as a reader. Again, I don't see this with a lot of other true crime authors. What is your approach and thought process to this in research and writing that it comes across that way?
Well, I mean, there is a kind of sociological element to the books I write that I'm very aware of. One of the things that has always interested me and that I deal with probably most explicitly in a recent book called Maniac about the Bath school disaster of 1927 is why when you do the kind of research I do, one thing you discover is the disheartening fact that any day of any year, horrific murders occur somewhere. I mean, really atrocious kinds of killings. But only a tiny handful of them end up sort of resonating with the public and becoming, well, sometimes they just enter into the cultural mythology. Something like the Leopold and Loeb murders of the 1920s. I mean, it wasn't, compared to some of the other murders, if you read the newspapers of the time, the tabloids of the 1920s, it was a relatively unexceptional case in the fact that they just murdered one victim. But, it struck this great chord in the country because it touched on so many fears and anxieties about what was happening to the youth of America. Leopold and Loeb became the symbols of what they call this out of control flaming youth of the jazz age and so on and so forth. So, that's one of the reasons it's important in my work to set it in the context of the time and place where the crimes occur. I feel you can learn as much about a particular historical era by looking at the crimes that the country was obsessed by at that moment, as you can from looking at, the idol, the heroes they worshipped, or, the political stuff that was going on.
Right.
So, I mean, that's one answer to the question. And I think I forgot the second part of the question.
No, that you don't make it, you don't lack any detail, but it's not overly gory.
Yeah. Well, I try to avoid sensationalizing. I mean, the crimes themselves are so horrific, that they don't really require, any sort of, elaboration or. So yeah, I try to maintain, while conveying the horror of the crime, I try to maintain sort of a neutral tone when I describe what exactly happened and just let the facts, again, which are awful enough, speak for themselves.
Yeah. It definitely comes across that way. And again, for somebody who's not maybe a true crime reader who can't take a lot of those gory details, like you do an excellent balance of that. I do have
Yeah.
to say.
Well, I mean, a good example, again, the Ed Gein atrocities, again, don't require any embellishment, although they have sometimes been embellished.
Right.
But an example of that is when I was doing the Gein book, there were photographs of, I don't know if you recall the details of the Gein crime, but
Yes.
his last victim was this middle-aged woman named Bernice Warden that he killed and took back to his farm and strung up by the heels and basically dressed out like a deer. And there were photographs of that, some of which had appeared in an earlier book about Gein. And I deliberately chose not to reproduce those for that, the very reason. I mean, they're just assaultive in many ways. So
Yeah.
I mean, you find them now. I mean, you can just find them on the internet now.
Right.
Back when
Right.
I wrote, yeah.
So how do you select which cases that you want to research and write about?
Well, I've been so immersed for so long, for better or worse, in the history of American crime that I know about a lot of cases. But I look for cases that I can make a compelling, meaningful story out of. And again, I tend to look for cases often that were very, very sensational at the time, and that struck some kind of chord with the American public at the time, but for a variety of reasons have faded into obscurity. So again, the book my book Maniac, which I published a couple of years ago, is about what remains the worst school massacre in U.S. history, where this guy named Andrew Kehoe blew up the public school in this town of Bath, Michigan, and killed, I think 38 children, along with some teachers and other bystanders. And it was a case that made national headlines for a few days and then was basically pretty much forgotten. I mean, I've heard from a lot of people in Michigan who never heard of it. And I explore some of the reasons why a crime of that magnitude so quickly faded into obscurity. So again, I look for cases that, it's not a matter of finding cases where, the crimes are particularly gory or particularly horrific, because there are all too many of those. I mean, again, you can find horrific murders any day of the year. I look for ones, that to my mind resonate with some kind of meaning about the culture and society, and also, have characters. There has to be a story. There have to be characters that are interesting to write about and to explore the psychology of. And I look for story elements because I see my task as turning this dry material of newspaper clippings and psychiatric reports and so on and so forth, into hopefully page-turning narrative.
Right. So you actually answered one of my later questions, because I was going to say that book that you just referenced about the Bath School massacre is or Bath School disaster, my apologies, is one of my favorite books of yours. And that was one of the questions I was going to ask was, you read about it, and I just thought, how have I never heard about this case?
Yeah.
You did an excellent job in kind of explaining how it kind of slipped back into, history and just hasn't. Yeah. So your most recent book, again, Murderabilia, A History of Crime in 100 Objects, you illustrate that someone wanting to own or collect murderabilia is actually not a new concept, but has been around for hundreds of years. Can
Yeah.
you speak a little bit about that? In particular, maybe some examples of just how far back this goes?
Well, in some sense, it probably extends back to the beginning of our species. I mean, we know that in certain Aboriginal cultures, killers keep mementos of their victims, scalps or shrunken heads or whatever. But at least in terms of recorded history, it extends at least as far back as the Middle Ages that we know of, where people wanted some kind of mementos relating to executed criminals. In the Elizabethan era, the executioner, one of the perks of the executioner was that he could flay the skin off the executed victim, and those things could be turned into pouches or other kinds of souvenirs. That happened as late as the 18th century, actually probably into the 19th century. There's a famous pair of serial killers, Scottish serial killers, Burke and Hare, who were started out as grave robbers, but then decided it was easier to just murder people than to dig up coffins, because back then in Scotland, as in many places, there was a shortage of cadavers for medical schools or anatomy schools to use. And there were quite a few actually, physicians who would pay grave robbers, what they called resurrection men, to provide them, no questions asked, with these dead bodies that they could use in their anatomy classes. And Burke and Hare, again, started just, one of them, I forget which one, ran an inn. And they just, discovered that it was easier to kill lodgers and bring the fresh corpses to these doctors. But when Burke was executed, some of his skin was turned into, it's called a pocketbook. It's really a kind of notebook, not a purse. There's a picture of it in my book.
Mm-hmm.
There are other cases where when a prisoner was hanged, the executioner would get to keep the noose, and he would cut it into 1-inch pieces and sell them to people who wanted, again, a memento of the crime. And during the French Revolution, they would set, you can go watch, on a Sunday afternoon like today, instead of going to the multiplex to see a movie, you would go to the Place de la Révolution and see a few people, a bunch of people being beheaded. And there were peddlers who would, sell, women could come away with guillotine earrings, and they would sell little toy guillotines for the kiddies, who could then take them home and chop off the heads of birds and other small creatures. So, so it's not at all, as you say, a new phenomenon. There's some impulse behind it, which, I suggest in my book, has almost a weird quasi-religious quality to it. I mean, I describe a lot of these things as the shadow side of saints' relics. Mm-hmm. The saints' relics are these objects that possess some aspect of the holy. And, these murderabilia objects, possess some quality of the unholy, the evil, the malignant. And I think there's some, there might be different impulses behind the desire to collect it. Sometimes, there are certain amulets of evil that are meant to ward off evil, killing fire with fire kind of thing. Another impulse might be just to, the sense you have some control now over this evil force.
Yeah.
Anyway,
and it's interesting that when you mentioned that, on a Sunday afternoon, for example, people would go to watch these, hangings or executions, and it wasn't just adults going. I mean, there were children that would be there too in the audience watching this, and it was normal.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, if you see the movie or read the book, True Grit, for example, one of the first things that the protagonist, Maddie, I believe her name is, does, is attend a double or triple hanging. And I mean, those things often had these carnivalesque qualities to them. Well, another book I wrote years ago called Hell's Princess, about the female serial murderer, Belgunis. When her atrocities were discovered, she, for those of you, your audience members who don't know, Gunness was this Norwegian immigrant who killed off a couple of husbands, collected their insurance money, bought a large farm in Indiana, LaPorte, Indiana, not that far away from Chicago. And she would lure lonely Norwegian bachelors. She put these marital ads in Scandinavian language newspapers, luring these lonely Norwegian men to her farm with the promise of possible marriage and co-ownership of the farm. She would always advise them to bring their life savings.
Yeah.
And, when they showed up, they didn't last very long. She would poison them, then chop up their bodies and bury them in her yard. And when her crimes were finally uncovered, like the Sunday after they were uncovered, thousands and thousands of people showed up at the farm, to tour the place, to buy postcards. They sold postcards of the, of the rotting remains of the victims, and people couldn't get enough of that stuff. So again, that kind of thing has always been going on.
Yeah. That is Hell's Princess. That is actually another one of my favorite books of yours. And with that, I like at the end of the book, you don't just kind of end it with, the fire happening and here's these remains. There's the question of are those bells remains or not?
Yeah. Well, that's a lingering mystery that might get resolved. But yeah, I mean, as you know from reading the book, she burned down her house. They found in the ashes of the basement the torso of this woman clinging to the charred remains of these children, but the torso is headless. So there were right from the start, many people believe that Belle had somehow lured another woman of her approximate stature out to the farm and killed her and used her as a decoy and got away with things. And as late as the 1930s, there was a belief that this one woman in California was actually Belgunis. And people have continued to try to discover some definitive evidence of whether she survived or not.
Yeah. Oh man.
I was hoping that I was hoping I'd be that person.
I was hoping so too.
At one point I thought I had gotten close, but then, well, that's why the subtitle of the book is part of the reason it's called The Mystery of Belgunis.
Right.
Because there remains an unresolved question.
Right. So to jump back to your book, Murderabilia, what I really like about this book as a reader is you get to learn essentially a little bit about 100 cases. And not all of them are well known. Some are, some aren't. If the reader is interested in learning more about this case, they can, find a couple of pages on one of these cases and then continue to do some research.
Yeah.
What was the process you used in selecting which items and which cases to cover in this book?
Well, again, many of them were very obvious. If you're going to do a history of crime, there are certain people you have to include. Others, partly some of them were dictated. Again, these are, having done this kind of work for what is now closing in on 40 years or something.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. They're all, I knew about basically, none of these cases was unfamiliar to me. And again, many of them were cases one has to you have to include Leopold and Loeb and the Lindbergh baby kidnapping and Charles Manson and Al Capone. I mean, like Bonnie and Clyde, there's some you can't not have in a book like that. But as for the others, some of them were dictated by whether or not I could find some interesting object associated with the case. Because there were some crimes I was interested in writing about, but I couldn't really find an interesting object. And, the objects in the book, very important springboards for the stories. So, there were occasions when I couldn't do that. Some obviously were cases I'd written about already. And for that reason, some of them, like the Bath school disaster, cases that I felt were very significant crimes, American crimes, but that had largely been forgotten by the public, and that I, striving to revive the memory of.
Yeah. One of the items of Murderabilia in the book that you describe is actually one of the pieces that I heard on another interview that you did that you were able to obtain, and that was a hand-carved wooden box from the mad sculptor Robert Irwin, which you did write a book about him as well. Can you tell us how you were able to obtain that wooden box?
Well, so Robert Irwin, who is known in the tabloids as a mad sculptor, was a very, very talented artist. He was also completely insane. Again, it's another case of, an enormously sensational crime at the time that has largely faded into obscurity. On Easter Sunday, 1937, he murdered 3 people on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. It was this very, very horrific and again, sensational triple murder. But Irwin was in and out of mental institutions throughout his adult life. And when he was incarcerated, he would make money to spend at the commissary or whatever by creating these works for doctors, nurses, attendants, and so on and so forth. He would make sculptures, or in this, he would sometimes carve these objects. So after my book came out, I was contacted by a woman who had read it, who told me that her husband, her late husband, had been an attendant at one of the asylums that Irwin had been locked up in, and had purchased from Irwin this hand-carved box, which is this kind of remarkable object. It's quite large, actually, and it is carved on the top, on its lid, and on each of its sides with a bas-relief image of this nude model who is actually one of Irwin's ultimate victims. It was a woman he knew. He boarded with the family. Her name was Ronnie Gideon, and she used to model for these pulp true crime magazines and so on and so forth. Anyway, she sent me a picture of this, and she said, I have it. Doesn't really mean that much to me, and I think my husband, kind of maybe would have liked you to have it. So, excuse me while I just get a glass of sip.
Yeah.
So I said, well, I'd love to buy it from you. I can't remember exactly where she lived, but she was down south. Anyway, I flew her to New York, which is where I live. Met her at LaGuardia Airport. I offered to put her up in hotels so at least she could enjoy the city for a little while, but she just wanted to go right back home. And I purchased it from her. I'm not myself a collector of murderabilia, but in the course of, for one reason or another, my writing career, certain objects have come my way. But this is one of my prized possessions.
Yeah. So since you said, so what other objects have come your way, if you don't mind sharing?
Well, I have, sometimes friends give me weird gifts. I mean, I have watercolor painting by, I forget which horrific sex murder. I mean, I don't have a lot. I have original letters, actually, that were written by some notorious 19th century serial killers. I have, trying to think. One thing when I write my books, I often like to have some object connected to the crime sitting on my desk, only because, it just makes, it makes the whole thing more tangible, more real to me, more palpable. So, for example, I have, it's not an original Kehoe thing, but I have a portion of a Pyritol box. Pyritol, again, for your audience members who don't know, Andrew Kehoe was this respected member of this farming community in Michigan called Bath, a very small town. He was a member of the school board. Anyway, he unraveled mentally. He had the classically paranoid psychology of a mass murderer. He began to believe, his life was falling apart. He couldn't pay his mortgage. His wife was very ill. He was having trouble meeting the medical bills. He felt that, the community had turned against him, and he decided he was going to kill himself. But, again, as mass murderers do, go out with a bang, take revenge on the world, on the people he blamed for his failures. So at that time, which was the 1920s, after World War I, the U.S. government had all of this surplus gunpowder left over from the war, and they made it into this sort of low-level TNT called Pyritol, which was sold to farmers for use in clearing their land of tree stumps and boulders and so on and so forth. And Kehoe got hold of, I can't even remember how many crates of this stuff, but he would sneak.
A lot.
He had a key to the schoolhouse because he had been a school board member, and he would sneak in at night, and he rigged up the basement of the school with all this explosive. And he had some mechanical ability. He made a homemade timer. He set it to go off early in the morning on the last day of school. And his plan was to blow up the whole school. And if he had, he basically would have killed every kid in the community. Right. But some of it, for whatever reason, failed to go off. He did destroy one entire wing of the school, killed all these children, killed several teachers. And then when the first, everybody flocked to the scene and was desperately trying to dig out survivors and so on, he loaded his pickup truck with shrapnel and more dynamite, drove it down to the scene, blew himself up, killed a bunch of other people. So he was both, not only responsible for the worst school massacre, but he was the first American suicide bomber, really.
Yeah.
But anyway, so when I was writing the book, I got hold of, can't remember where, it might have been on eBay. Somebody was selling not an entire crate, but one of the slats of a crate of Pyritol. The same exact stuff that Kehoe used. From the same. Again, it wasn't one of his crates, as far as I know, but the same batch. So again, having something physical connected to the crime, makes it more vivid for me when I write about it.
That's an interesting process. I didn't know that. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
So in regards to true crime as a whole, interest has, from my perspective, just really grown over the last few decades. There are so many more podcasts, TV series, books, as well as trials now that are just being covered on live television for everybody to watch and follow. In your opinion, how has that interest in true crime expanding been for the positive and also maybe for the negative?
Well, I see myself as a pioneer. When I started doing true
you are actually, to give credit where credit is due, you really are.
Yeah, well, thank you. So, when I first wrote Deviant, the Ed Gein book, which was my first true crime work, the genre was looked upon as so kind of subliterary that the publisher, Simon & Schuster, wouldn't even publish it as a hardcover book. At that time, true crime, especially historical true crime, the received wisdom back then that if anybody was going to read true crime, it would have to be something contemporary. But the kind of book I was writing, publishers looked at it as like, the kind of thing you might pick up at on a paperback book rack in a Greyhound station or something. So that was pretty much, the state of true crime for a very long time. I mean, even though Capote's In Cold Blood, which really was the first great modern masterpiece of the genre. One thing, let me just digress for a moment.
Yeah.
One of my books is a book I edited for the Library of America called True Crime in American Anthology. And it's an anthology of short pieces, true crime pieces, but it goes all the way back to the Puritans. Because, one of the I think, in fact, the first book ever, or the first pamphlet ever printed in this country was a true crime book. The Puritans, whenever they would have to execute somebody for a crime, would publish these little pamphlets which related the crime and also offered, these edifying lessons about, what happens to sinners. And they also contain what were called gallows sermons. Just when a criminal was about to be executed, a minister would deliver a sermon about sin and redemption and so on and so forth, and would usually contain the confession of the killer and some statement of his repentance and hope for salvation and so on and so forth. So, point being, there's always been an audience for true crime writing. Throughout the 19th century, again, if you go on eBay, you can find these things. It would be called, trial pamphlets and crime pamphlets, often illustrated with, I have some in Murderabilia. I have one on Jesse Pomeroy, the Boston boy fiend of the 80s. So there's nothing new about the genre, but it's always regarded, again, as a little, as they say, disreputable, subliterary. Then Capote's book came out, which showed that true crime could, produce a literary masterpiece. But even after that, things didn't change very much. What has happened, I think, I attribute two things to this true crime boom. it seemed to me that it was sparked by the almost simultaneous appearance of the podcast Serial
Yeah.
and the documentary Jinx on HBO.
Hmm.
That seemed to have ignited some larger scale interest in true crime. So yeah, I mean now it's everywhere. True crime. I mean,
Yeah.
very very different from it used to be. As to whether it's good or bad, I don't see anything wrong with it. It's people. It's an appetite that needs to be fed. People are always wondering. In fact, I just got into an argument with a friend who I now no longer think of as a friend about why people watch true crime. But it feeds some sort of need. The way I have always seen it is, and this is not an original observation by any means, that us moral, law-abiding people have a part of ourselves, that's still very primitive, that still revels in thoughts of violence and killing, that needs to somehow be satisfied. That true crime provides a safe, socially acceptable, uh, economically advantageous way of doing that. Um, Stephen King has this metaphor in one of his books, that if you go down deep enough into the human psyche, there's a trap door. And if you open it, there are these ravenous alligators. And every now and then you got to throw a piece of meat. The philosopher William James spoke of the carnivore within. We evolve, violence is as much a part of our nature as sex is. And, like the sex drive, the impulse to violence needs some kind of outlet.
Yeah.
The old days, the outlets used to be much worse. Again, you would go to watch people being beheaded or drawn and quartered or disemboweled. One example I give is the movie Braveheart, which I'm sure you saw.
Mm.
The real William Wallace, when he was executed, thousands of people gathered around to watch him being disemboweled slowly, and dismembered, until he was finally put out of his misery. It was a process that went on and on and on. And people want to see a real human being subjected to that kind of hideous torture. Now we become, now we're satisfied with just going to the movies and, sort of seeing Mel Gibson being, photogenically tortured.
Right.
You know what I mean? So there's always going to be the need for that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And yeah, so yeah.
Yeah. I have to say,
yeah.
yeah, so I went to school for psychology, and I've always, ever since I was a child, been interested in true crime. I grew up right next to Salem, Massachusetts, where the Salem witch trials happened. So I don't know. I feel like growing up, at least for myself, it was one of those, I didn't have anybody else to talk to about true crime. It's like family and friends knew I was in it, and it was like, oh, that's just Danielle. And growing up and going to college, and again, I discovered your books very early on. I've been a fan of your work for decades, and it gave me what I wanted to learn. And you were really one of the first few authors, because you've been doing this for so long, where I got that. Flash forward to now, where I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with, in Boston, the Karen Reed trial that's going on. And you walk into a store and you're waiting in line, and just people are chatting like, hey, what do you think of the case? It's just it's so different than when I grew up and I had no one to talk to about true crime. It's just,
again, you are prescient in your yeah, I know. It's it's pretty amazing to me that that the world has swung around to my own personal obsession.
Yeah. So in regards to, again, as I mentioned, you've been doing this for quite some time. What upcoming books or projects do you have in the works? And if you have any, are you able to tell us anything about that?
Well, there is one book that is being edited at the moment, called 50 States of Murder, which is a book. It's a book in which I deal with, maybe 5, 6 crimes. Again, it's a little in line with the kind of work I've always been doing. It deals with crimes that have entered into the criminal lore of the state, sometimes even into the folklore of the state, but that most people outside the state would not be aware of. So that's in the works. Again, the manuscript is done. It's in the editing stage. There is one project, I don't want to say too much about it, but there is one project about a very, very sensational late 19th century serial sex murderer that I've long been interested in. I've written a little bit about him in different books, and I hope to be able to still retain enough of my faculty, to write a book about him in the not too distant future.
Okay.
Yeah.
When do you have an idea? Just because I'm already like, okay, I need to get a hand on any book that you write. Do you know when the 50 States of Murder book will be coming out?
Sometime in 2025, I believe, maybe the fall of 2025. Also, I'm not sure if are you aware of the graphic novel I did, the Ed Gein graphic novel I did with Eric Powell?
No.
I highly recommend it. Eric Powell is, to my mind, the greatest comic book artist now practicing. He's best known for a comic book called The Goon. But a few years ago, we collaborated on a graphic novel, which won a number of awards as the best graphic novel of the year, called Have You Heard What Eddie Gein Done? And, tells, it's a graphic novel about Ed Gein. Highly recommended. Anyway, he and I are also working slowly on another graphic novel. So.
Well, I know I will be purchasing something after this interview.
Well, it's pretty great, actually. I mean, Eric is an amazing, amazing artist. So
awesome.
Yeah.
Well, you answered as the kind of interview kind of folded, you answered a lot of my questions. And it's, again, my favorite books that you've written, definitely, and you touched upon those again, was The Maniac, The Bath School Disaster, as well as Hell's Princess Belgunis. I was going to ask you to talk about each of those for our audience, but you already did that, so which is great. I've definitely recommended those books to so many people, as well as, again, I do true crime book recommendations videos, and I definitely, when I got this, discussed this. So I'm hoping if people from my audience have not picked this up, that they do. But if anybody's interested in learning more about you or just purchasing and kind of scrolling through any of your books, where can they find more about Harold Schechter?
Well, I have some kind of website I never go on. I think haroldschechter.com or something like that.
You do, yes.
And then, Amazon has all my books. So, I mean, I'm an Amazon person myself. So yeah. Easily accessible there.
Yes. And for anybody that still has like a Barnes and Noble near them, I know I do. They do have your books. I did check. So that's are there if anybody has that. Well, thank you so much, Harold, for coming on Danny After Dark. This has been honestly a pleasure and truly an honor. I've been reading your work for so long. It's an honor to be able to meet you like this.
That's so nice. Well, I very much appreciate that, Danny. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, anytime. Well, thank you again for joining us. And everybody, remember, until next time, we don't live in darkness. Darkness lives in us. Bye, everyone.